So in 2019, I gave a talk at a United Israel conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. I didn't know anything. I'd never heard the name Shapira, but I was pleased that you came to that conference. And I taught a class, gave a lecture called Finding the Hand of Moses, the Torah within our Torah. This is what kind of got me into this. And it was all about the mysterious references, I understood it, in Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, and Deuteronomy 31, verse 24 through 26, where it says that Moses wrote this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, unto the very end. He gave it to the Levites and set, and so forth. And so I began to look at that and think about, and I've heard you mention this before too, what is this little scroll that Moses wrote that's described in the Torah? And so that kind of had me thinking, is there a scroll that's mentioned in the Torah that I need to be looking for? And so, long story short, James Tabor sent me an email in December of 2019. And he said, you might be interested in this. And the article was an online review of a book by Hanan Tigay. And the book was called The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible. Well, that's right up my alley. It fit within my thinking at the time. I said, what is this? So James and I both read through the book. I devoured it. And it is the story of a Jerusalem shopkeeper and antiquarian, an agent for the British Museum. The guy was one of the most, he discovered some of the greatest manuscripts. And that's how you and I have just recently reconnected, is that you're chasing down some of these old manuscripts, and Shapira's name is attached to a lot of them. He would go into Yemen and into Egypt.
And there are other ones that he brought them that his name is not attached to.
Right.
Maybe because they didn't keep good records, or there was some issue of, well, we'll get to some of the issues. But I want to go back to the issue of the scroll within a scroll, because I'm not sure I ever put it quite that way, about what Moses wrote. So look, so in my upbringing, which was a ultra-Orthodox rabbinical approach, there was this idea that Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he received the Torah, the entire Torah, from Genesis 1:1 to Deuteronomy 34:12.
Right.
And there's even discussions in the rabbinical literature that as he wrote down Deuteronomy 34, which is the account of his death, that he wrote it in tears. Because he's writing about his own death prophetically.
Right.
And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And there are even rabbis in the Middle Ages who say, yeah, that's the story we were told, but come on. I mean, they don't put it exactly this way, but basically, come on, that's a story for children, that Moses wrote down Genesis 1:1 to Deuteronomy 34:12 up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, which it does not say.
Right.
But actually, like Ibn Ezra, for example, says Moses wrote individual scrolls, and eventually the scrolls were attached together. And that's why some things are out of chronological order. Famously, Numbers chapter 9 takes place before Numbers chapter 1.
Exactly.
And we know because it gives dates.
Yep.
So when they sewed those scrolls together, it wasn't that they made a mistake, although I guess you could say that, but actually it seems more likely that it was arranged thematically in that section rather than chronologically. And this actually spawns an entire genre of interpretation that the rabbis have, which is juxtaposition of sections.
Yeah.
Right? Why is this section next to that section?
There's no early or late in the Torah.
Well, that's a separate thing. That's the Numbers 9, Numbers 1. Juxtaposition is, why is this section next to that section? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because Moses went into the tent and he wrote down what God said. Well, but if he wrote everything on a separate scroll, then he just stuck it in the jar, stuck it in the jar, stuck it in the jar, right? And there was a jar full of a whole bunch of little scrolls, and each scroll might say, this is the Torah of the burnt offering, right? The instruction. And that's the heading that we actually have in a certain section in Leviticus. This is the Torah of the guilt offering, right? So that was maybe a separate scroll. And maybe it even said that on the outside of the scroll. This is, so when you open it up, you're like, wait, what is this? Okay, it says this is the Torah of the burnt offering, right? So when they sewed them together, in some instances, they did it based on theme, on subject. There's instances where you can demonstrate in Deuteronomy, which is a bit surprising for a bunch of reasons that I'm not going to get into.
Right.
But you can show that they have juxtaposition based on common words or common themes. Like there's a section where it says, don't lend on interest. And the commandment immediately after that is, don't bring the price of a dog into the temple. What does that have to do with it? Because the word for interest means to bite.
Okay.
And then you have a dog, and dogs bite. And it's a word that applies to a dog biting, right? So it seems like there was maybe a really small scroll, and they sewed the other one next to it. All right. So when it says Moses wrote it says Deuteronomy 31:24, and it came to pass when Moses finished writing all the words of this Torah, this instruction, upon a book until their completion. So what does that refer to? Does that refer to the book of Deuteronomy? Does it refer to the 5 books of Moses, right, from Genesis 1:1? And what you're suggesting is maybe it doesn't even refer to the entire book of Deuteronomy. Is that right?
That's correct. And just briefly, just to touch it, what it made
blasphemy.
I know.
All right, go ahead.
No. But what really took me back was reading. He completed it to the very end. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wait a minute, whoa.
That's chapter 31. It continues for 3 more chapters.
Okay, so you get it. Now, so then it caused me to really look, and part of my book and part of my lecture at the time, I didn't know who Shapiro was. I was writing a book called Finding the Hand of Moses. What did Moses write? Because the other thing that was really getting my attention is that throughout the Pentateuch, if you look, of course, we don't meet Moses until Exodus, obviously, but the only place where first person is used is in Deuteronomy, and not all of Deuteronomy. I think Moses is mentioned some 700 times roughly, which indicates a third person. Anyway, this is what got me thinking, is there something which records something within the Torah that Moses actually wrote? That's what really drove me. And so Tabor sent me this article. And the article was about Hanan Tegay's book. And so I thought, well, let me check this out. Got into the book, couldn't put it down, realized that this guy Shapira was a scroll merchant, if you will. He's running around the world at the time. And, some people have accused some of his practices, Nehemia, as being a little bit shady, but he would acquire.
Not a little bit shady, very shady. Before we get to that, I want to go back to the first person thing, and I want to challenge you and at least challenge people to think about this. So your argument is when it says, and the Lord spoke to Moses saying in Numbers, let's say, or in Leviticus, that wouldn't be Moses writing that. It would be somebody else writing about Moses. And that's a possibility. And I don't have a problem with that because I would just say it was Joshua. It says Joshua was in the tent and he heard everything God spoke to Moses. You may disagree with that. You're entitled to that opinion.
It could be, yeah.
And then therefore they weren't Moses's words anyway. They were God's words speaking to Moses, if you believe what it says.
Yep.
And if you don't believe what it says, it has nothing to do with Moses anyway.
Right.
And so I want to challenge that because writing in first person, I don't know that it's obvious that is the only way for someone to express themselves. And I'm going to bring something. I did a series that I don't know if it's going to be broadcast before this or after this, depending on when the time slot where it gets edited. But I did a really interesting series with a historian who's an expert on early Mormonism.
Right.
So we have the Book of Mormon, and unless you're a believing Mormon, you pretty much think Joseph Smith wrote the whole thing, Joseph Smith Jr. And it's not in first person, but it's but then he also has things called the Doctrines and Covenants, which is sometimes in first person, and then sometimes it's not in first person, it's in third person, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not an expert in this, but it's something to the effect of God revealed his word to his servant Joseph Smith. But we know Joseph Smith made that whole thing up and wrote it. So, but it's not in first person. So, and that's a relatively modern example. But why would it have to be different? Meaning, why is it that Moses couldn't write and Yehovah spoke to Moses saying, isn't that possible? Meaning,
it certainly, there are a lot of things possible, but just to kind of take this.
And God, and some people are going to be really upset. We say, lahavdil elef havdei havdalot, to separate 1,000 differentiations between Moses and Joseph Smith Jr. But the point is, if you don't believe the Torah is the word of God, right, you're taking a secular scholarly approach, fine, we're going to explore that. Then why couldn't Moses have written Leviticus and Numbers the same way that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Jacob and the Book of Moroni and all the others?
I'm with you. I'm with you on your statement. Keep it separate, but the thing that really made me think, this wasn't. I didn't arrive at these questions based on reading anything in the academic world. It was just the text. So it wasn't like I said, well, what do the scholars believe? And that's what I'm going to go with. I'd never read a book from a scholar about the text. I came from a very religious upbringing. This is the word of God. And, let's start there and just really dig deep. So when I got to Deuteronomy, and the first time I really recognized and the Lord and Yehovah spoke unto me saying, I remember thinking, that's interesting. It really just kind of caught me off guard, because I thought I knew the Torah pretty well, but I recognized that it was only in Deuteronomy. And again, it could be that in some cases, there are times where I write a description for my class. In this class, Ross talks about, and somebody could say, look, Ross, you did it too. So I get that. But what really hit me was in Deuteronomy, at the end, even there are some discussions, I believe, in rabbinic literature where they say, the discussion you brought up earlier about, did Moses write about his own death? And people say, well, no, Joshua wrote that. Of course, some say he wrote it.
It's a machloket. It's a debate. What was I going to say now? I forgot. All right, keep going. Sorry.
So Deuteronomy 34, begins, Deuteronomy 1 begins, these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. At least that's the way I would translate it. And so it seemed to me, and this doesn't take anything away from the sanctity of the text, but it struck me as something which another scribe, Joshua, I don't know, someone else wrote, because it's describing presumably from west of the African Rift, events that transpired east of the Rift. Right.
Okay, and I'll play the devil's advocate again.
Okay.
There used to be a country called the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan.
Yep.
Why was it called Transjordan? Because it's on the east side of the Jordan,
right,
opposite the land of Israel, what they call the British Mandate of Palestine. So it's entirely possible to sit in the eastern side of the Jordan River and call yourself Ever HaYarden, Transjordan.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying. You're raising interesting questions and valid questions. And these are definitely something to think about. Jews don't have a problem asking questions, especially when they're asked in faith. Meaning, if they're asked to, like, hey, let's undermine the Bible, well, Jews aren't comfortable with that.
Well, that's right. I'm out if that's the case. Yeah.
Well, but if they're asked in the sense of, hey, we want to understand what's going on here and understand the text better, and, because maybe you might say, hey, there's a contradiction. Moses died on Mount Nebo and never entered the land, yet it says he wrote it in Transjordan, meaning the western side of the Jordan from where the Israelites were. Well, that doesn't make sense. What did he... swim across the Jordan, write the scroll, and then run back, right? So you're asking what I think are really valid questions and interesting questions.
Yeah, and without belaboring, because this is a very detailed discussion, and again, these are questions that come to my mind as I read, in the desire to understand the Word of God.